when you're in pain, soothing as a springtime rain, to have a friend right in your corner, your heart will feel a little warmer. Tender loving care, tender loving care, each warm and friendly touch lets someone know you care so much. Tender loving care, tender loving care.
Good evening, I'm Dr. Greenbrier Almond, and thank you for joining us on our program, Tender Loving Care. Each week on Channel 3, I'm happy to talk about this interface between Christianity and medicine. And one of the hearts of this is our ability to be family, to love one another, to care for one another, and as we say, tender loving care. And I'm going to tell a story this week that I picked up, was reminded of. This is called the story of Ruby Bridges. And this is a real live story, a real person. Dr. Robert Coles, a child psychiatrist from Harvard, has written this story, and I heard him give the talk down in New Orleans a number of years ago. And it fascinated me the first time I heard it. And as I was visiting my granddaughters down in Farmville, Virginia, I went to a museum, a civil rights museum, and was drawn to this book, which is a summary of Dr. Coles' story of Ruby Bridges. Now, we have to go way, way back in time to 1960. At that time, the schools were not integrated. Even here in Upshur County, probably after 1954, we became integrated, but we used to have several black schools in our county. There was one called Victoria School, which was someplace near where the Academy School is now on Victoria Street. I don't think there's any building or remnant of that left. And then there was the Central School, which is also closed now, but is behind the Wesleyan Arts Center on Baxter Street. And so the old Central School was a Negro school or a black school. And so we had separated schools here in Upshur County at one point in our history. There was a Supreme Court decision in 1954 that all schools would be integrated, and that you could not even have separate schools that were equal, because what was really happening, frankly, was that the all-white schools were better, were superior schools to the black schools, and so they were not equal. But they were separated. And so for a long time people said, well, let's just have separate but equal schools. But that was not happening. So anyway, the courts intervened and decided that schools needed to be integrated. All of this was also happening in the military. They began to have black and white units after World War II and in the Korean War. And so we were becoming a nation that was integrated. Well, this Ruby Bridges is a young girl in 1960, and she has a fascinating story. Her parents were sharecroppers in Mississippi, which adjoins Louisiana down in the south, and the farms were being mechanized. So her father picked crops for a living. They were very, very poor, very poor. You can imagine if you're digging potatoes or harvesting corn or picking cotton. It's seasonal. Depends on the rain, depends on the crop conditions, when you work, when you don't work. So they were living just hand to mouth. They hardly had anything, but it all fell apart for them as black sharecroppers in Mississippi when the owner of the land decided to get machines and go toward mechanization. And they just didn't need the sharecroppers to pick the crops. So this family moved to New Orleans. And they moved to the 9th District, which is, as you know, if you followed the news, where Katrina, the hurricane, came through. All of that district was very poor to begin with and has been flooded and destroyed at this point in time. But it was always poor, and it was always endangered of flooding. But this is where they could move to in New Orleans. So this is where our story begins. And Dr. Coles, at that time in 1960, was a medical doctor, and we had a draft. So doctors coming out of medical school, as I graduated in 1974, could be drafted into the military for 2 years. And this was 1960. Dr. Coles was serving his time in the military as a doctor, and he was assigned to Mississippi, to a base there. And so he was watching the news one evening, and he realized over in New Orleans they're going to try to integrate schools. And here, the decision of the court was 1954. This is already 1960. So 6 years have passed. They still don't have integrated schools. And they were going to do it they're going to do it in several schools, and the federal marshals were going to intervene because the local police, the state police of Louisiana, just were not going to uphold the law. And so federal marshals were called in to walk with the children to school and into the school so they would not be killed by mobs of people who were standing along the sidewalk and were chanting and trying to scare the children and threatening them with clubs and all sorts of things. So it was a sad state of affairs for America at that time as they were integrating. And it's a part of that history. And Ruby's mother says it this way, looking back. She says, "Our Ruby taught us all a lot. She became someone who helped change our country. She was a part of history, just like generals and presidents are a part of history. They're leaders, and so was Ruby. She led us away from hate, and she led us nearer to knowing each other, the white folks and the black folks." So you can tell her mother, of course, is very proud of what Ruby did. But she was just an ordinary little girl, just ready to get started in school. And she was 4 years old when they moved from Mississippi, and then she was ready for school in 1960, ready for first grade. Now, the family had, and this is a program, as I talk about this on our program, Tender Loving Care, is that interface between Christianity and medicine. And I'm very glad that Dr. Coles told the story as a medical doctor, but also I'm very glad that Ruby was being raised as a Christian. And actually it mirrors the life of Jesus, what happened to her. Of course, Jesus faced on Palm Sunday crowds of adulation. Hosanna literally means save us, save us. And so people were yelling at Jesus to be saved, and they wanted him to be the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords and save them from Roman rule. And then later on, these same crowds and the mobs turned on him and said, "Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him." And of course, we've just come through Easter, and we understand that he was killed on what we call Good Friday, and he was buried, and the third day he rose from the dead and overcame death and solved the sin problem for all of us. And so the Easter story mirrors a lot what happened here to Ruby. But anyway, here she is. They were being raised in the church. And Ruby's mother said, "We wanted our children to be near God's Spirit. We wanted them to start feeling close to him from the very start." And bless their heart for doing that. It's good to raise up children in the fear and the admonition of the Lord. Well, there was a judge who had to intervene in New Orleans to get the schools integrated. And so he ordered 4 black girls to go to 2 white elementary schools. 3 of the girls went to McDonald 19, one of the schools, and 6-year-old Ruby Bridges was sent to a first grade all alone in the William Franz Elementary School. This was a judge's order, a federal judge ordering this family, this poor black family, to let the little girl go to this all-white school. Well, actually, the parents were proud that Ruby was chosen, and they realized this was a big event in the American history, and of course for the black race, and of course they understood that this was God's will. And we sat there and we prayed to God, Ruby's mother said. We'd all be strong, we'd all have courage, we'd all get through any trouble that happened. And Ruby would be a good girl, and she'd hold her head up high and be a credit to her people and a credit to all the American people. We prayed long and we prayed hard, Ruby's mother said. And she had the backing of her church. Well, Dr. Coles was over in Mississippi, and he began to watch the evening news programs over in New Orleans, and he realized that this little girl, bless her soul, was going to have to walk through a mob every day to school. Now, and marshals are going to walk with her. They had guns. They're going to arrest people. They're going to protect her. But still, the tension of a little first grader walking through these crowds who were yelling bad things at her would be horrible. And so, but Dr. Coles called up the family, said, "May I come and visit you?" And so they said, "Yes, you can come over." And he sat down with them in their kitchen and explained and said, "Now, I'm a medical doctor." He wasn't a psychiatrist at that point, though later on he became a child psychiatrist and won the Pulitzer Prize for his books on children. So Ruby changed his life too. But in any event, Dr. Cole said, "I would like to come over once a week, and on Thursday night, it's not a church night, we can sit in your kitchen, we can talk about how the week's going. I would like to visit every week for the year that Ruby's going to this school. And I want to follow what happens. I want to know how she handles the stress and what happens to her. And I want to encourage the family to do the right thing and Ruby to do the right thing and be a part of this process." And so the family said, "Yes, Dr. Coles, you can do that. You're welcome in our home." And so the first day of class, there was a large crowd of angry white people. They gathered outside the Franz Elementary School. The people carried signs that said they didn't want black children in white schools. They called Ruby names, and they wanted to hurt her. And as I mentioned, the city and the state police stood by and did not do anything. The President of the United States, at that time, as you remember, was still President Eisenhower and then President Kennedy. They ordered the federal marshals to walk with Ruby into the school building. And these marshals carried guns. This was a serious issue. And thank goodness we didn't have to go through all of that here in Upshur County, but we were all aware of what was happening in the South. At Little Rock, Arkansas, the National Guard had been called in. Here we are, the federal marshals are being called in to integrate the schools in New Orleans. So every day, for weeks that turned into months, Ruby experienced that kind of school day. Now, once she got inside the Franz Elementary School, none of the parents sent any students, any white students. So she walked into an empty building. The kids were being kept at home. And there was a teacher. Mrs. Henry was her teacher. And Mrs. Henry would begin to teach her numbers and reading and writing. And Ruby was a good student. And Mrs. Henry observes that she was well behaved and eager to learn, and she made the most of this. But even though every day she was shouted down, and people pushed against her, toward her, and the marshals had to keep threatening the people to step back and let her pass. And Ruby would walk through the crowd, and she would never say a word. Well, Dr. Coles wondered about this, Robert Coles, as he came, and he would say, "How are you doing this? What is keeping you up?" And she would say, "Well, I'm praying. My parents have taught me how to pray. I'm remembering that Jesus didn't do anything wrong. He was filled with love, and yet he died. He died. He was crucified. And I know I'm in danger. I know people are yelling at me, wanting me to die, wanting to murder me. But I want to get through this." And so every day Ruby went to the classroom with a big smile on her face, and she got down to the business of learning, her teacher said. She was a polite student. She worked well at her desk. And she enjoyed her time there. She didn't feel particularly anxious. She wasn't irritable. She wasn't scared. She seemed very normal and relaxed. And Ruby began to learn what she had to learn for first grade. Sometimes Mrs. Henry would talk to her about it and say, "Well, how are you going to do this? Why aren't you nervous? Why are you so calm?" And Mrs. Henry really, frankly, was concerned that Ruby would wear down and the pressure would be too great. And Dr. Coles was concerned about the same thing. Well, there was one morning, this in February, as this went on, and I think I remember this as a little boy because it made national news. If Ruby refused to go to school, see, the judge's order didn't matter. I mean, a judge can order a child to go into school, but what are you going to do to a child that refuses to go to school? And Ruby probably had a right to refuse because, my goodness, what pressure she went through every day walking through a mob. And but in any event, the teacher was looking in the window, from her window down onto the sidewalk down in front of the school, Franz Elementary School, and she saw that Ruby stopped. And the crowd sensed victory. They said, blood, blood. We got blood in the water now. She stopped, and she may turn around and go home. And Ruby appeared to be talking to herself, and the teacher was observing this. Dr. Coles was watching this on TV from Mississippi from the base, and he said, uh-oh. And as he told the story to the doctors in New Orleans at our medical meeting, he said, uh-oh, this is it. You know, she's broken down. She cannot go forward. She's going to turn. She's going to run home. And who would blame her? And so it was an amazing thing. And the mobs began to howl, and they began to scream, and they were screaming bloody murder. And Ruby was facing these mobs, and she appeared to be talking to them. But when Mrs. Henry asked her about that as she got into the classroom and wondered what she was saying, and if they were going to and she was frightened that they were going to kill her. Even the marshals were frightened. They were walking beside her, and even though they had guns and everything, they were frightened for their own life, and they were trying to persuade Ruby to march along and get through this mob and get into the safety of the school, but she would stop, and she wasn't budging. And she looked like she was talking to the mob. Well, the teacher asked her about this. It was fascinating, isn't it? Everyone focusing down on a child. And Mrs. Henry asked her what it was that she was doing. And Ruby said, I wasn't talking to those people. And Ruby got irritated. And she says, but the teacher said, I saw your lips moving. She says, I wasn't talking to the people. I was praying. She said, every day before I got to the school, I would say a prayer. And every day after I left the school, I would say a prayer. And I would always say the same prayer, morning and night. But on this particular day, I was walking to school, and I forgot to pray. I forgot to pray until I got right into the middle of the crowd. And then I realized I had to pray. She said, I was praying for these people. Every morning, she says, I would stop and pray for those people that hated me. And then here I was praying in the middle of the angry mob. And this was the prayer that Ruby was taught by her mother and father to pray. And the ones that she agreed with it, she thought that it was a good prayer. She said this twice a day. Please, God, try to forgive these people. Because even if they say bad things, they don't know what they are doing. So you could forgive them, just like you did those folks a long time ago when they said terrible things about you. So little Ruby was identifying with Christ, a Christ who did say on the cross, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing. And he did face the angry mobs who said, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. And he obeyed God the Father, and of course, even to obey him to be crucified on a cross, which is a horrible, horrible death, and another topic altogether. But Ruby got through, she said the prayer, and now gradually, then after that, maybe God answering her prayer, there were some white parents who said, well, what are we doing here? Our kids are staying out of school, they're not getting their education at Franz Elementary, which they're entitled to. And here's Ruby getting a good education, and the mobs cannot wear her down. And so several of the children, parents began to send their children back to school. And then by the second year at Franz Elementary, all the students returned. And at that time, then the mobs subsided because they said, well, we're defeated. The schools are integrated. The federal judges, the President of the United States have won. Ruby has won. And Ruby's God has won. God was there with her and protected her. And little Ruby has grown up. She graduated from the Franz Elementary School. She went on to high school, graduated from high school. and she's married to a building contractor. When Dr. Coles gave this talk to us at our medical meeting, he had gone to visit Ruby and her family. He said she's a fine Christian lady. She's a fine mother to her 4 children. She's a good support to her husband, who's a building contractor. And furthermore, since Katrina, Hurricane Katrina, which leveled and flooded the Ninth Ward, she has begun a Ruby Bridges Educational Foundation, whose focus is to rebuild the William Franz School. And so she's stepping up to embrace history once again. One of our most famous children, Ruby Bridges, and now as a Ruby Bridges, an adult woman, helping to rebuild her city of New Orleans, especially her school. There's even a museum, a children's museum, for her and other children in Indianapolis, Indiana, which I've never visited, but I would love to visit. And it's called The Power of Children Making a Difference. Fascinating story about Ruby Bridges, the story of Ruby Bridges, a little black girl who helped integrate the school system in New Orleans, and did it as a Christian, as a little girl who was a Christian from a Christian home, saying her prayers morning and evening, even facing death. What courage she had. Well, this came forward to me not only because I'm a psychiatrist and I've tried to follow the teachings of Christ also, but Dr. Coles, when he spoke to us, he had other books called Children of Crisis, 5 volumes. 2 of them won, 2 in the second and third volumes won the Pulitzer Prize, which is one of the highest prizes for writing that we have in America. And I've read those, and then he's gone on to write others, The Call of Service, The Call of Stories, The Moral Life of Children, and The Spiritual Life of Children. All these things are researched and proven to be helpful to the health of children to have a spiritual life. Of course, I read this and picked it up in Farmville, Virginia, where Maria, our daughter, who is a psychiatrist, married to Justin Pope, who is a vice president or chief of staff, as they call him, at the Longwood University. And Longwood University has a large campus, and then right beside the campus, probably to become incorporated if Justin has his way, this old black high school, similar to the Central School that we have here that comes up against Westlane's campus. This black high school, which is turned into a wonderful museum to the civil rights movement. And this will become part of the campus, and of course it will have lessons for the students now. And they have probably about 30% of black population in Prince Edward County. However, they only have about 9% of the student body of the university. It's a state university with lower tuition for the residents of Virginia. Only about 9% of the black students are going to Longwood University. So Justin feels he has a mission here to increase the student body proportionally to the population so that blacks can have equal education. And they're welcome, of course, at Longwood University. Another thing that would be important to realize here in Prince Edward County is that they held out 5 years. 5 years without, when the integration order came, the Brown versus the school board in Topeka, Kansas. That happened in 1954. Prince Edward County in Virginia closed their public schools for 5 years. Now, for the white students, they opened up academies, they called them academies, private schools, often in churches, and the students were getting, the white students who could afford to go were getting education. Some of the black students, because people realized what was happening, were actually sent out of the county, had to go to other states to get their public education. So it was a horrible, horrible 5 years in Prince Edward County before they came together and integrated their school system. And of course, now it's in good order. That was in 1959, 1960, the same time that this was happening in New Orleans, and the federal courts were intervening. Same thing was happening in Prince Edward County in Virginia, not too far from us. Well, we've come through a lot as a nation, haven't we? And one of the other things that happened today that just brought this whole thing full circle was Senator Jay Rockefeller came to West Virginia Wesleyan College, gave a wonderful talk to the students and to us who could attend. The public was invited to come and hear him and talk about a life of public service, how he was called to public service because of what happened to him in West Virginia. He was down in Edmonds, West Virginia, in Kanawha County on the Kanawha-Boone County line. He was a volunteer in service to his community, a VISTA worker, volunteer in service to America, a 2-year obligation that he undertook after he graduated from Harvard, and he was interested in, of course, a challenge. He was looking for a challenge, and oh boy, did he get it, he said, because he could see here that the school buses were not even running into Edmonds, and the hillbillies, the children in the mining camps there were not getting their education. He started a baseball team. The baseball team lost all of their games because they had never played ball. They didn't know what bats were. They didn't know what balls were. They were so far behind. He didn't tell the story today, but on another occasion, I remember him telling a story about trying to help one of his students get a job, and he went and took the young boy into Charleston, and they were going to interview for a job, and the sun was shining in a window, and the window had blinds, but the young man didn't know what blinds were. Anyway, the human relations representative doing the interview asked the young man to close the blinds so that the sun would not be shining in his eyes so they could conduct the interview. And the young man went over and tried to close the blind, but he'd never seen one before. And so he pulled and he yanked, and finally he pulled the whole thing down. It just collapsed to the floor. Of course, the interview was over. He didn't get the job. And then VISTA worker Rockefeller, Jay Rockefeller, was embarrassed by that, but he realized he had met his challenge, that the children needed a lot more than he could give them. And at that moment, then he decided to go into public service, and he decided to spend his life helping West Virginians. And he's literally spent 50 years of his life here. As he pointed out to us, the state is 150 years old, and he's been here for 1/3 of the state's history, and very much a part of it. Now as our senior senator retiring, also governor for 2 terms, Secretary of State for 4 years, president of Wesleyan College for 3 years, and of course a VISTA worker for 2 years. So there's a great history going back to this same era of Ruby Bridges here in West Virginia. I appreciate you joining us on our program, Tender Loving Care. A special thanks to Channel 3 for this opportunity coming your way each week. It's a challenge to combine Christianity and medicine, but there's always something that happens. I'm going to be focusing in the future weeks on children's education issues. I happen to be running for the school board again, have served 4 years, and we have an election coming up in May 13, and it'll be an opportunity to run again for 4 more years. There's a lot that we can do for our children here. We don't have, of course, the mixed population, the black and white, as they do in the South, but we have some minority students who need special attention. But really, all of our children are disadvantaged at some point just because of being in Appalachia. And it is our obligation to try to level the playing field. We can do that through technology. And thank you all who approved the levy recently for 5 more years. That allows us to keep working on technology, keep on maintaining our buildings, improving the education, and also conducting summer school and other things that we can do with levy money for children who fall behind, so that our children will have the best education so they can get on the world stage and make a contribution, just as we can say here that Ruby Bridges got her chance in 1960, has made a tremendous contribution to the history of America and, of course, to her city of New Orleans. Well, thank you for joining us today. We'll see you next week.
Stories of a West Virginia Doctor, written by Dr. Harold D. Allman. A collection of 55 short stories about his experience as a small-town doctor in central West Virginia. And Tender Loving Care. Stories from a West Virginia Doctor, Volume 2, written by Dr. Greenbrier Allman, using videotapes to write 70 additional stories of his father's very colorful life as a small-town doctor. They can be found for purchase at Amazon.com and most local bookstores. Tune into Channel 3 Buckhannon for Tender Loving Care with Dr. Greenbrier Allman, where he talks about the connection between Christianity and medicine.